25 identical machines came off the boat in the Panama Canal Zone, same year, same model, impossible to tell apart from the tree line. They went to work on bridges, roads, drainage, infrastructure, not glamour. Then the jobs ended. 24 of them were cut apart where they stood. One was not. Nobody wrote down why. Not in the paperwork that survives, not in the local histories, not in the two-line captions museums still use to describe it today. 25 machines, identical down to the rivet pattern, the same three-cylinder Bucyrus design, the same crawler tracks, the same house that could spin the full circle instead of stopping dead at the rails the way every shovel before it had to. And nothing on any of them marked which one would matter. 100 years later, this one is still in working order, 8,000 feet up a mountain in Colorado, blowing its steam whistle over a farmer's market. That part is documented, photographed, filmed even. What isn't documented is the only question that matters. Out of 25 identical machines, why did the record spare exactly one? So ask it straighter. A machine that just sat there, waiting for a torch, doesn't usually get to argue its case. Something about this one made somebody, somewhere, decide it was worth the paperwork to keep it. Or nobody decided anything at all, and it survived the way a lot of things survive. By accident, by being in the wrong place at the right time. We don't know which one it is yet. Here's what we do know, and it's worth sitting with for a second. This machine did more digging after the original canal was already open for business than most people assume any shovel ever did there at all. That's not the part of the story anyone tells. 24 of these machines were judged worth destroying, and what they were built to survive in the first place had nothing to do with the canal itself. Start with the number that should be the whole story and isn't. 534 of these machines came off the Bucyrus line between 1923 and 1939. Bucyrus for the first 4 years of that run, Bucyrus Erie for the rest, after a 1927 merger that changed the letterhead and nothing about the steel underneath it. 534 is not a small number. It's a whole population of machines, built to work quarries and rail cuts and gravel pits across a country that couldn't get enough of them. Today, as far as any museum or preservation group has documented, you can count the survivors on one hand. 3, by the last honest count. 1 in Minnesota, 1 in California, 1 in Colorado. Only one of the 3 ever left the country. The Minnesota machine sits at a steam thresher's reunion in Rolag, coal-fired, and by local reputation the largest operating coal-burning shovel of its kind left anywhere in the country, a claim that depends on how you count, and nobody's fully settled it. The California machine took its own strange trip to get where it is. Built 9 years after the Panama batch, worked dam projects and depot yards across the American West, and in 1992 was trucked to a museum in pieces, hauled across the Golden Gate Bridge on flatbeds, past a lane of startled commuters who had no idea what they were driving next to. Interesting machines, both of them. Neither one ever crossed a border, and neither one has anything to do with the story the Colorado shovel is telling. The Colorado machine, the one this is about, is the only Bucyrus 50B on record that ever worked the Panama Canal Zone. The other 2 never crossed a border. They spent their working lives exactly where they were built to work. American dams, American gravel, American coal. So when someone calls this shovel the only surviving Panama Canal steam shovel, that claim needs a footnote, because it isn't quite true. Machines from the canal's actual construction, an earlier and much larger generation, still exist elsewhere. What's true, and what almost nobody bothers to clarify, is narrower and stranger. This is the only survivor of one specific shipment. 25 machines, same model, same year, sent south together. 24 of them are gone. Here's the machine itself, on paper. 130,000 pounds by the weight recorded with it, 65 tons on a scale. And yet half the literature filed alongside it calls it a 75-ton machine. Nobody has gone back and reconciled the 2 figures, and at this distance, probably nobody can. That's 10 tons of steel that either exists or doesn't, depending which sheet of paper you trust. It tells you something about how loosely anyone was tracking these machines at the time, which matters later, when 24 of them disappear without even that kind of paperwork to argue over. It isn't only a shovel either. Pull one pin, swap the working end, and the same 3 engines that dig can also lift, drag, or clamp. Shovel, crane, dragline, clamshell, 4 machines wearing one chassis. Nothing in the surviving record explains exactly how a design built for brute digging also learned delicate crane work off the same gearing. We'll get to that. For now, notice what kind of machine this was. Not a specialist, built for one job and nothing else, but something closer to a tool a foreman could point at almost any problem on a site and trust to handle it. That versatility is very possibly the reason it went to Panama doing infrastructure work at all, instead of the single-purpose digging its ancestors had done a decade earlier, on the canal itself. And that's the detail that should stop you. This machine never dug the Panama Canal. The canal was already open for business, ships already transiting it 9 years before this shovel was even built. It arrived to a finished canal that still needed roads and bridges and drainage to keep functioning. Unglamorous work, infrastructure work, the kind that doesn't get its own chapter in the history books, done by 25 machines nobody expected to become famous. 24 of them were destroyed, cut apart where they stood, most likely, the steel most likely sold for whatever scrap was worth by the pound at the time, though even that detail has slipped out of the record entirely. Nobody wrote down why this batch was retired when it was, or on whose order, or what happened to the one machine that didn't join the other 24 on the scrap pile. What survives is the after, a machine that made it out, a country it wasn't supposed to still be in a century later, and a silence in the paperwork exactly where the explanation should be. Every one of these 25 machines was built to beat one specific enemy, and the enemy wasn't jungle, or heat, or rock. It was a set of rails. The company that built this machine had already built half of Panama's first fleet, 17 years earlier, under an entirely different era. Bucyrus started in 1880 in Bucyrus, Ohio, moved to South Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1893, and by the time the United States took over Panama Canal construction, it was already the country's dominant maker of steam shovels. Of the 102 machines that dug the canal between 1904 and 1914, 77 were Bucyrus-built, 95-ton machines riding on standard rail, throwing 5 cubic yards of spoil per bite into muck cars that hauled it off to be dumped in the swamps and lowlands of the zone. President Theodore Roosevelt sat in the operator's chair of one of those machines in November 1906 on an inspection tour, and the photograph is one of the most reproduced images to come out of the entire project. That machine, and its 95-ton sisters, has nothing to do with the machine this is about. That fleet finished its work in 1914 when the canal opened, and the survivors of it were reassigned, sold, or scrapped in the years that followed. Easy to miss, looking backward from a century later, is that finishing the canal did not finish the work. A functioning canal through some of the wettest, most geologically unstable ground in Central America needed roads. It needed bridges. It needed drainage cut through jungle that reclaimed anything left alone for a season. And the machines built to dig one canal, once, on rails that ran exactly where the dig required, were the wrong tool for maintaining an entire zone's worth of infrastructure indefinitely, wherever the next problem happened to turn up. That's the gap Bucyrus answered in 1923 when it put crawler tracks under a new 50-ton class machine and gave it something none of Roosevelt's photograph-ready predecessors had: a house that could rotate the full circle, 360 degrees, without stopping dead against the limits of a railcar frame. Before this, a working shovel needed rail under it to move at all, and a support crew, as many as 6 men on the older canal-digging machines, whose entire job was walking ahead of the shovel, laying short sections of track, then pulling them up once the machine had crawled over them, then relaying them further on. It was slow, it was labor-intensive in an era when labor was the largest cost on any job site. and it meant a shovel could only go where somebody had already decided to lay rails, which was a serious problem for a machine that might need to dig a drainage ditch today and cross to a bridge site 6 miles away tomorrow. Crawler tracks solved the mobility half of that problem outright. The machine could walk itself, slowly, wherever the work was, no track gang required. Full rotation solved the other half. A rail-bound shovel with limited swing had to be positioned exactly right before it could start working. A shovel that could turn all the way around could dig, swing, and dump in almost any direction without repositioning at all. Put those two things together, and it isn't just a faster shovel. It's a shovel that can be set down almost anywhere and simply get to work, which is precisely the kind of machine an operating canal zone needed by the early 1920s, its original construction fleet long gone, a permanent maintenance and improvement program still ahead of it. The timing wasn't an accident either. The 1920s were the decade American road building turned into a genuinely national project, funded by governments at every level and hungry for exactly this kind of machine, mobile, self-propelled, able to work a job site without a rail spur run in first. Steam shovels had existed for decades, but it was this new generation, walking on its own tracks instead of waiting on somebody else's, that made general contracting on public infrastructure practical at the scale the era demanded. A 6-man track gang, paid by the day, doing nothing but laying and lifting rail so a shovel could inch forward another few yards, had been an acceptable cost when the alternative was no shovel at all. It stopped being acceptable the moment a competitor could put a crawler machine on the same job with a fraction of the ground crew and none of the delay. Whatever else it was, the 50B was Bucyrus reading that shift correctly and building the machine the next decade of construction work needed. Hold that thought, because 25 machines built exactly this way are about to walk into a jungle together, and the record is only going to bother explaining what happens to 24 of them. 534 of this new model eventually came off the line, but the batch that matters here is 25 of them, built and shipped south together to do exactly the unglamorous work the design was made for: bridges, roads, and drainage, and the ongoing job of moving dirt and rock the canal's operation still required years after the big excavation was finished. None of the 25 were there to dig the canal. The canal was already open. What these 25 machines were there to do was keep it working, which turned out to be a job with no fixed end date, performed by a machine built to go anywhere the zone needed it, on tracks that needed nobody's help to move. It's worth being precise about what that means for how this story should be read. This isn't the story of the machines in Roosevelt's photograph, and it isn't the story of the Culebra Cut, or the French failure that came before the Americans, or any of the history most documentaries about this canal already tell. Those machines dug a canal. These 25 machines kept one running, and somewhere in the years that followed, something happened to all but one of them that nobody thought was worth writing down. None of that mobility worked without something running it, and the something was steam, 3 separate engines, each with its own job, all fed from the same boiler, all doing something that could hurt the men standing near it if any one part let go under load. The main engine, a double-cylinder unit 8 inches by 9, did the heaviest lifting in the most literal sense, raising and lowering the dipper, powering the winch that raised the boom, and driving the crawler tracks when the machine needed to move at all. A second engine, smaller, 6 inches by 6, handled nothing but the swing, rotating the entire upper house, cab, boiler, boom and all, through the full circle that made this design different from everything that came before it. A third engine, matched to the swing engine's size, handled the crowd, pushing the dipper handle out toward the digging face and pulling it back. A separate steam cylinder did one job alone, tripping the latch on the bottom of the dipper, so the load dropped exactly where the operator wanted and nowhere else. Say that back in plain terms, One machine, 3 engines, one boiler feeding all of them, and every motion the machine could make, lifting, swinging, reaching, releasing, running through its own dedicated set of moving steel, all of it exposed, all of it under load, most of it within arm's reach of at least one of the men running it. There was no single spot on this machine where a man could stand and be safe from every one of its motions at once. That same rigging is what let it become 4 different machines without ever leaving the yard. Pull the dipper assembly off the end of the boom, and the same winches that hoisted a load of spoil could just as easily hoist a hook on a cable, and the shovel became a crane. Rig a bucket to drag along the ground instead of biting into a face in front of the machine, and it became a drag line, useful for ditch work and grading where a digging shovel's short reach couldn't go. Fit a set of hinged, scissoring jaws instead of a dipper, and it became a clamshell for lifting loose material straight up out of a hole rather than scooping it sideways. 3 engines, 1 boiler, 4 machines, depending entirely on what iron got bolted to the end of the boom that morning. For a canal zone job that might mean digging a drainage cut on Monday and lifting bridge timbers into place on Wednesday, that kind of machine was worth more than a specialist that could only do one of those things well. None of it was gentle. The boiler that powered all 3 engines ran under real pressure, hot enough and dangerous enough that a failure in the wrong fitting could hurt or kill anyone standing close, which is why a fireman's entire job, on a machine like this, was watching that pressure and nothing else. Feeding coal, watching the gauge, making sure the one component that could turn catastrophic stayed inside the range it was built for. The swing engine put the entire multi-ton house into motion around a fixed pivot, which meant there was always a wide, fast-moving arc behind and beside the machine where a man had no business standing when the operator called for swing. The crowd and hoist engines worked in tension through cable and drum, under enough load that a frayed or overworked line could snap back with the force of a whip made of steel wire instead of rope. Every one of these motions did useful work. Every one of them, misjudged by even a second, was also the kind of motion that ended careers, and on machines like this across the industry, ended lives. None of that reads the same on paper as it felt standing near one running at full output, and the trade-wide accounts of the era agree on the texture even where they disagree on the numbers. The boiler didn't just heat the cab, it heated the air for yards around it, so a fireman worked a coal-fired furnace in the open under a tropical sun and called it an ordinary Tuesday. The swing engine didn't hum, it clanked and hissed in bursts, steam venting in short violent breaths, timed to every motion of the house, loud enough that crews communicated as much by hand signal as by shouting. Cable under load didn't look dangerous so much as it looked bored, sitting there doing nothing until the moment it wasn't, and every operator on a machine like this learned early exactly how much distance a snapped line needed before it stopped mattering whether you'd been paying attention. None of that made the job glamorous. It made it a trade you respected from the ground up, the same way you'd respect a bandsaw or a live rail, because the machine had no opinion at all about whether you'd been careless. Even the machine's most basic fact, how much of it there actually is, doesn't fully agree with itself. The weight most often recorded alongside this shovel is 130,000 pounds, 65 tons on a scale, which lines up with what a machine of this rough size and era should weigh. But the same shovel is filed, in other records kept alongside it, as a 75-ton machine, 10 tons heavier than its own scale weight. Neither number is obviously wrong. Manufacturers in this period often named a model after a rated class rather than an exact shipping weight, and paperwork copied from one document to the next for decades tends to accumulate exactly this kind of small, unresolved contradiction. Nobody alive today can say with certainty which figure is more accurate, or which one Bucyrus meant when it stamped the model number on the plate. What both numbers agree on is the order of magnitude: 60-some tons of coal-fired, high-pressure 3-engine machinery built to move ground faster than any crew of men with picks and mule carts ever could, and dangerous in almost every direction it was capable of moving. That was the machine that went to Panama. Not a single-purpose digger, but a shovel, a crane, a dragline, and a clamshell built into one chassis, versatile enough to justify sending 25 of them south for years of open-ended infrastructure work, and dangerous enough in ordinary daily operation that running one for a living was its own skilled, physically demanding trade. Running one of these for a living meant becoming part of a very small, very coordinated team, because no single man could operate this machine alone. The standard arrangement, documented across Bucyrus shovels of this general class, put one man, the engineer or operator, in charge of swinging the house and hoisting the dipper, working a bank of hand levers and foot pedals that fed steam to each engine independently. A second man, the crane man, worked the crowd and the dipper's release, timing the dump to the operator's swing so the load landed exactly where it needed to go and not a foot short or long. On a coal-fired machine, a third man, fireman, sometimes doubling as oiler, kept the boiler fed and the pressure where it needed to be. A job that never stopped, because the moment it did, every other motion on the machine stopped with it. These men worked by feel and by eye, not by radio or signal light. A half-second of bad timing between the operator's swing and the craneman's release meant a dropped load in the wrong place at best, and at worst meant iron moving somewhere a man's body happened to be standing. No verifiable names survive for the specific men who ran these 25 machines during their years in the Canal Zone. What survives instead is the working environment they operated in, and it was not a forgiving one. The isthmus is one of the wettest places in the hemisphere, and a coal-fired machine running at full pressure in tropical humidity meant heat from two directions at once, the boiler at your back and the climate everywhere else. Crawler tracks that solved the old rail problem still had to fight mud that could bog a 65-ton machine to a standstill, and machinery from this era was riveted and cast rather than welded, which meant that when something broke, it usually meant a foundry-level repair rather than a quick fix with a torch. None of that made these 25 machines unusual. It made them typical of every piece of heavy equipment that worked that climate, on that kind of job, in that decade, which is worth remembering because it means the men who ran them earned every bit of the machine's output the hard way, one shift at a time, for years, on a job nobody was writing songs about. Whatever happened to those 24 machines, and whenever it happened, this one machine's working life did not end with them. It went to California first, then to Denver. The record gives no exact date for either leg, only the order they happened in. Then, in the early 1950s, two brothers changed its life a second time. Roy and Russell Durand hauled the shovel to Rollinsville, Colorado, a small town in the mountains west of Boulder, and put it to work at the Lump Gulch Placer, 6 miles south of a town called Nederland. Placer mining isn't canal work. It's the business of running loose gravel and streambed material through water to recover the gold caught inside it, and a machine built to dig, crane, drag, or clamp turned out to be exactly what that job needed. Almost certainly rigged as a dragline or crane rather than a straight digging shovel, moving overburden and feeding gravel toward the wash plant instead of biting rock out of a jungle cut. The same versatility that got it assigned to bridges and drainage in Panama a quarter-century earlier is very likely the reason two brothers running a small mountain placer operation found a 30-year-old steam machine worth hauling in at all, instead of buying something new. The move itself isn't documented in the kind of detail that would let anyone reconstruct it hour by hour, and that's worth being honest about rather than filling the gap with invented color. What's certain is the geography, and the geography alone tells you this wasn't a simple job. Rollinsville sits in the foothills west of Boulder, climbing fast into terrain that was, in the early 1950s, served by narrow mountain roads built for wagons and Model Ts long before anyone imagined trucking 65 tons of riveted steel up them. Getting a machine of this size out of wherever it had been sitting in Denver and up into Gold Camp country meant disassembly, oversized loads, and almost certainly more than one truck on roads that hadn't been built with a machine like this in mind. Two brothers did it anyway, and however they managed it, the shovel arrived and it went back to work. Placer mining ran on water and gravity as much as on steel. Streambed material got shoveled, dragged, or dumped into a sluice, water did the sorting, and gold, being heavier than almost anything else running through the system, settled out where the current couldn't carry it any further. A machine that could crane, drag, or clamp was worth more here than a machine that could only dig, because half the job wasn't digging at all, it was moving already loose material efficiently from one place to another, feeding a process that never stopped needing more gravel than two men could shovel by hand. They ran it there for the better part of 3 decades. Through the mid-1950s, through the 1960s, into the 1970s, the same 3 engines that once helped keep a tropical canal zone's infrastructure running spent their second working life pulling gravel out of a Colorado gulch, fed by whatever fuel the Durans kept it on, tended by whichever brother had the boiler duty that week. The record doesn't preserve their day-to-day routine in the kind of detail a documentary would want. No diary entries, no interviews on file, nothing beyond the bare fact of the operation and its dates. What the record does preserve is the end of it. In 1978, after roughly 25 years of placer work, the operation at Lump Gulch stopped, and so did the shovel. Whatever the Duran brothers went on to do after that, the record doesn't say. What happened to the machine they'd hauled into the mountains and run for a quarter century is easier to trace, because it happened in public decades later, in front of cameras. That part comes later. What matters here is what didn't happen in 1978. The shovel wasn't cut apart, the way 24 of its Panama sisters had been decades earlier. It wasn't preserved or protected in any deliberate way either. It was left where it stood, at the edge of a played-out placer claim, 65 tons of riveted steel, with nowhere left to go and no one left to run it. Every machine like this one was living on borrowed time by the very decade it was built. Steam had been the only real option for heavy earth-moving machinery since the 1880s, but by the 1930s, diesel engines were smaller, needed no boiler, needed no fireman, and could be started in minutes instead of the hour or more it took to raise a full head of steam from a cold boiler. Electric shovels, wherever power lines could reach a job site, were cleaner still and cheaper to run once the infrastructure existed. Bucyrus itself saw the shift coming and started building diesel and electric shovels alongside its steam line well before the Second World War. A steam shovel wasn't just an aging machine by the middle of the century, it was an expensive one to keep. A fireman's wage, coal or oil by the ton, boiler inspections and certifications, all of it for a machine that a diesel unit with half its crew size could increasingly outperform. But obsolescence alone doesn't fully explain a decision this total, and it's worth being skeptical of any version of the story that treats it as inevitable. The model itself didn't die out anywhere near as fast as the industry's overall shift to diesel and electric power might suggest. Bucyrus 50Bs kept working American quarries and dam sites for decades after this design's supposed expiration date. One of them was still earning its keep at Bonneville Dam and Hanson Dam projects into the 1950s. One of them was still running well enough, decades further on, to be considered worth trucking into a museum rather than melting down. If the model itself remained useful enough elsewhere to keep working into the back half of the 20th century, obsolescence by itself doesn't cleanly explain why an entire batch of 25 identical machines was wiped out on one continent, on what appears to have been one decision at some unrecorded point in the middle of the century. Something more specific than industry-wide progress made that call, and whatever it was, it isn't written down anywhere that survives. Steel had real resale value throughout this period, war-driven demand for scrap metal spiking more than once between the 1930s and the mid-1940s, so cutting up 24 obsolete machines and selling the material was never an irrational decision on its own terms. It doesn't explain the 25th. A scrap contract doesn't usually stop one machine short of a clean number for sentimental reasons, and nothing in the record suggests sentiment had anything to do with it. That's the economic story, and it explains, in general terms, why an entire category of machine became a liability almost everywhere it worked, at roughly the same historical moment. What it doesn't explain is what actually happened to 25 specific machines in Panama, because on that point, the record simply stops talking. No surviving account gives a year for when the batch was retired from active work. No surviving account names who made the decision, what office signed off on it, or what the 24 condemned machines were worth in scrap steel at the time they were destroyed. The most detailed sources available, museum placards, historical society write-ups, the handful of paragraphs that exist about this machine at all, agree on the outcome and go silent on everything around it. 24 were destroyed, one wasn't. That's the entire surviving record of what should have been, for at least one of these machines, the worst day of its working life. Sit with how unusual that silence actually is. This isn't a case of conflicting sources arguing over what happened. It's a case of no source saying anything at all about the how or the why. Compare that to almost anything else about this machine. The model number is documented, the build years are documented, the crawler track innovation is documented. Even the contested weight figures are documented, contradiction and all. The one moment in this machine's entire history that most needed an explanation, the moment that decided whether it would end as scrap or as a survivor, is the one moment nobody wrote down. There are only two honest ways to read that silence, and neither one resolves it. The first is that somebody, at some level of the operation, made a specific choice to spare this particular machine, for a mechanical reason, a bureaucratic one, a personal one, and that decision simply never made it into any surviving paperwork, the way an enormous amount of routine institutional decision-making from this era never did. The second is that nobody decided anything at all, that this machine escaped the fate of its 24 sisters through nothing more deliberate than where it happened to be parked, whose desk its paperwork happened to land on, or which scrap contract happened to run out of budget before it got around to machine number 25. Both explanations are plausible. Neither one is provable. The most honest answer, based on everything that survives, is that the difference between being cut apart for scrap and surviving into the next century might have come down to nothing more meaningful than which end of a list a machine happened to sit on. That's a harder thing to sit with than a clean story would be. It would be more satisfying, frankly, to say this shovel survived because an engineer recognized something special in it, or because a Canal Zone official had a soft spot for the crawler design, or because it had already proven itself on some specific job in a way the other 24 hadn't. None of that is in the record. What's in the record is a batch of 25 identical machines, a decision that erased 24 of them completely, and a gap sitting exactly where the reasoning should be. What isn't a mystery is what came next for the one that lived. It left Panama, no date given, for California, and from California to Denver, sometime before the early 1950s. Then Roy and Russell Durand found it, hauled it into the Colorado mountains, and gave it a second working life that outlasted its first by several years, roughly 25 seasons at Lump Gulch against however many years it spent in the Canal Zone. A figure the record never quite pins down either. Then, in 1978, that ended too, and the machine went quiet a second time, not destroyed this time, but simply left, 65 tons of riveted steel sitting at the edge of a played-out gold claim with nobody left to run it and nowhere written down that said anyone ever would again. For 27 years, nothing happened to this machine at all, and that nothing is its own kind of fact worth sitting with. Through the rest of the 1970s, through the 1980s, through the 1990s, and into the new century, 65 tons of Bucyrus steel sat exactly where the Durand brothers' operation had left it, at the edge of Lump Gulch, exposed to Colorado winters at nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. Snow loaded onto a boiler that hadn't held pressure in decades. Rust worked into rivets driven by hand before anyone alive today was born. The crawler tracks that had once let this machine walk itself anywhere a Canal Zone foreman pointed, and then walk itself around a Colorado gulch for 25 more years, sat locked in place doing nothing while the mountain went on without it. It wasn't dug up for parts. It wasn't hauled off as scrap, the way its 24 sisters had been decades earlier. It was simply left alone, which, given what happened to the rest of its generation, might be the closest thing to mercy this machine ever got from anyone's paperwork. That changed because two people named Steve and Laurel Higgins decided it shouldn't stay that way and donated the machine to the Netherland Mining Museum. What followed was not a quiet transfer. A machine this size doesn't get relocated by backing up a pickup truck. Moving 65-plus tons of century-old riveted steel out of a mountain gulch meant heavy cranes, lowboy trailers built for oversized industrial loads, and a route chosen as much for what the roads could bear as for distance. It meant permits, escort vehicles, and almost certainly at least a partial disassembly to get the boom and house down to a size the mountain roads around Rollinsville could carry. It was involved enough and visually dramatic enough that a television crew thought it was worth filming. The relocation was shot for the History Channel series Mega Movers, and by one local paper's account, it went on to rank as the third most popular episode the show ever produced, ahead of derricks, church steeples, and entire buildings. The same program spent its run hauling across state lines. On October 21, 2005, the shovel made the trip from Lump Gulch to its current home behind the Nederland Mining Museum with a team that included a young man named Marcus If, who 2 decades later would still be one of the people keeping the machine running. Getting it there was only half the job. A machine abandoned for 27 years doesn't start again simply because someone wants it to. Getting it back to operating condition, a boiler that could hold pressure again, engines that could move under load again, a machine that could swing its house and lift its dipper the way it had for 2 employers and 2 very different countries, took real restoration work, performed by people who understood exactly what they were dealing with. Century-old riveted construction, 3 separate steam engines, a design nobody at Bucyrus had built in almost 90 years. It worked. Today, the machine that watched 24 identical sisters disappear in Panama and then sat alone and rusting in a Colorado gulch for longer than most of its working life combined is once again one of the largest steam shovels in the United States that anyone can still watch move. In the fall of 2024, on the machine's 100th year since it left the Bucyrus works, that fact stopped being an abstraction for anyone in Nederland who happened to be nearby. The town's farmers' market was running as it always did, people browsing produce, checking out the carousel of happiness a few blocks over, getting a beer at Knotted Root, when a steam whistle started sounding from behind the mining museum, unmistakable and completely out of place against the ordinary rhythm of a mountain town's Sunday. People stopped. Some of them had no idea the sound was even possible. A piece of equipment they'd half-registered as decoration, a big rusted thing behind the museum, turned out to have a working heart. At the controls were Marcus If, the same man who'd helped haul it out of Lump Gulch 2 decades earlier, and Emmett Hoyle, swinging the house, raising the dipper, opening and closing its jaws in front of a crowd that hadn't come expecting a demonstration and got one anyway. That's the machine as it exists today. Rideable, steamable, loud, 100-plus years old, and still doing the same 3 things its 3 engines were built to do in 1923: hoist, swing, and crowd, under the same rough mechanical principles that once made it useful enough to send to a foreign jungle and versatile enough to spend a second life dragging gravel through a Colorado gulch. 2 other Bucyrus 50Bs still exist, in Minnesota and in California, and both of them can make a similar claim to being rare survivors of an obsolete design. Neither of them can say what this one can. Neither of them was ever in Panama. Neither of them was one of 25, watched 24 sisters disappear, and came out the other side with no explanation attached to why. There's a version of this story that's really about more than one shovel. It's about an engineering trick invented to fix one specific and unglamorous mobility problem that ended up defining what a construction machine could be for the following 70 years, spawning a 500-machine production run and, eventually, mining shovels that outweigh this one 100 times over. It's about the Industrial Revolution reaching a jungle canal zone and then reaching a Colorado gold camp on the strength of the same 3 engines twice. And it's about the particular, unglamorous stubbornness it takes for 2 brothers, or a small museum board, or a handful of volunteers a century later to decide that a rusting, obsolete, technically dangerous machine is worth the trouble of saving, at least twice, when destroying it or simply forgetting about it would have cost nobody anything at all. That's really the whole shape of it when you step back from the details. 25 machines arrived together, built to the same drawings, impossible to tell apart by anyone standing at the tree line. They did the work nobody remembers: the roads, the bridges, the drainage that kept a finished canal functioning. Then the era that built them ended. Diesel and electricity made steam obsolete almost everywhere at once, and 24 of the 25 were cut apart and sold for the value of their own steel, with no surviving record of who made that call or why one machine wasn't on the list. That one machine went quiet twice more after that. Once in California and Denver, waiting for 2 brothers to find a use for it, and once at the edge of a Colorado placer claim, waiting 27 years for anyone to remember it was there at all. Each time, for reasons that mostly aren't written down either, somebody decided it was worth the trouble. It never dug the Panama Canal. It's not the last of its kind, and it's not the only surviving machine to ever wear a canal zone job. What it is the only one of 25 that somebody, somewhere, for a reason lost to the record, decided not to destroy, and a century and 2 countries later, it's still the machine that gets to blow its whistle over a Sunday farmer's market, while the other 24 are wherever scrap steel from the 1930s eventually ends up. Nobody wrote down why it was the one. Nobody ever will now. All that's left is the machine itself, still running, which is its own kind of answer to a question the record never bothered to ask.